February 15, 1944, 9:25, Monte Cassino, Italy. The low drone began in the south, a vibration felt in the chest before the sound actually registered in the ears. It grew steadily, a mechanical thunder rolling over the Leary Valley, causing the German paratroopers entrenched in the rocky slopes and the Allied infantry huddled in their waterlogged foxholes to look up. The sky, usually a canvas of gray winter overcast, was filled with the glint of aluminum. 142 B-17 flying fortresses, the heavyweights of the U.S. Army Air Forces, were in formation. They were followed by dozens of medium bombers, a massive armada totaling 229 aircraft. They were not heading for the industrial heartland of Germany or the oil fields of Romania. Their target was a single building complex sitting on a rocky spur, 1,700 feet above the valley floor. The Abbey of Monte Cassino. Founded in 529 AD by Saint Benedict himself, it was the cradle of Western monasticism. For 14 centuries, it had stood as a sanctuary of peace, a repository of art, and a beacon of faith. But on this Tuesday morning, to the Allied commanders struggling in the mud below, it was simply Point 593, a suspected German observation post that had to be erased. At 9:25, the lead bomber of the 96th Red Devil Squadron opened its bay doors. Within minutes, over 1,150 tons of high explosives and incendiaries began to rain down on the historic structure. The concussions were so violent they were registered on seismographs as far away as Naples. The pristine white walls, the grand courtyard, the centuries-old library, all vanished into a churning cloud of gray dust and black smoke. Inside the thick walls of the monastery, the occupants huddled in the cellars. They were not, as the bomber crews had been briefed, the elite troops of the Wehrmacht. There were no German radio operators calling down artillery fire from the bell tower. Instead, the cellars were packed with terrified Italian civilians, refugees from the surrounding villages who had come to the house of God seeking safety from the war that had consumed their homes. When the smoke finally cleared, the abbey was gone. In its place was a jagged pile of rubble, a moonscape of broken stone. Approximately 230 civilians lay dead, buried in the ruins of their sanctuary. The bombing of Monte Cassino remains one of the most controversial decisions of the Second World War. But to understand how the Allies arrived at this point, how civilized nations convinced themselves that destroying a cultural treasure was a military necessity, we must look away from the sky and down into the mud. We must rewind the clock 4 weeks, to the freezing rain of January and the bloody banks of the Rapido River. The road to Rome was supposed to be the end of the campaign, but in the winter of 1944, it felt like a distant dream. The Allied advance up the Italian peninsula had slammed into a wall. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander-in-chief south, had utilized the rugged geography of Italy to construct a series of defensive lines, the most formidable of which was the Gustav Line. This was not a line on a map. It was a masterpiece of military engineering. It ran across the narrowest part of Italy, anchored by swift rivers, jagged peaks, and fortified concrete bunkers. And the key to the entire line was the town of Cassino and the mountain that loomed above it. To get to Rome, the U.S. Fifth Army under Lieutenant General Mark W. Clark had to go through the Leary Valley. To enter the valley, they had to take Cassino. The First Battle of Monte Cassino began not with a strike on the monastery, but with a frontal assault that would become a byword for futility. On January 20, 1944, the men of the U.S. 36th Infantry Division, the Tea-Patchers from Texas, stood on the banks of the Rapido River. The name was apt. The river was swollen with winter melt and rain, the current swift and icy, the banks steep and slick with mud. Major General Fred L. Walker, commanding the 36th, had protested the order. He looked at the terrain and saw a kill zone. The Germans held the high ground on the opposite bank. They had cleared the fields of fire, sown thousands of mines, and sighted their MG-42 machine guns to create interlocking walls of lead. To cross the Rapido was to walk into the throat of the enemy. But General Clark was under immense pressure to break the stalemate and draw German reserves away from the upcoming landings at Anzio. The order stood. As darkness fell on January 20, the Texans moved out. Private Albert DeFazio of the 143rd Infantry Regiment later recalled the confusion. The night was pitch black, broken only by the sudden, blinding light of German flares drifting down on parachutes. As soon as the flares popped, the darkness was replaced by the terrifying daylight of magnesium, exposing the Americans struggling with heavy rubber boats and wooden footbridges. Then the German artillery opened up. Nebelwerfers, the screaming Mimes, howled through the air, their rockets saturating the riverbanks. Mortar shells walked up and down the assembly areas. Men were blown apart before they even touched the water. Those who managed to launch their boats found them capsizing in the swift current, dragged down by the weight of their ammunition and wet wool uniforms. The few who made it to the far bank found themselves trapped in a nightmare. They were pinned down in minefields, unable to dig into the rocky soil, with German machine gun fire slicing through the reeds just inches above their heads. The engineers tried frantically to build bridges for the tanks and heavy weapons, but the German fire was too accurate, too intense. The bridges were shattered as fast as they were assembled. For 48 hours, the 36th Division bled. Communications wires were cut by shrapnel, leaving isolated platoons to fight and die alone in the dark. The screams of the wounded mingled with the roar of the river and the crack of explosives. By the time the operation was finally called off, the 36th Division had suffered devastating losses. In just 2 days, the division sustained approximately 2,000 casualties. Entire companies were effectively wiped out. The Rapido River ran red, clogged with the bodies of young men from Texas. It was a tactical catastrophe that haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. The diversion failed to draw German reserves away from the Anzio beachhead, and it failed to secure a foothold across the water. The 36th Division was effectively combat ineffective, its regiments shattered against the German defenses. But for the Allied High Command, the map had not changed. The road to Rome was still blocked by the town of Cassino and the monastery above it. If the valley floor was a death trap, the only option left was the mountains. While the Texans were being mauled at the river, the U.S. 34th Infantry Division, the Red Bulls, was ordered to attack into the rugged massif north of the town. This was the high road to Cassino, a landscape of jagged limestone ridges, deep ravines, and freezing winds. Among the units attached to the 34th was a battalion unlike any other in the U.S. Army, the 100th Infantry Battalion. Composed almost entirely of Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans from Hawaii, these men were fighting for a country that had classified their families as enemy aliens and placed many of them in internment camps. They had something to prove, and they fought with a ferocity that stunned both their commanders and the enemy. On January 24, 1944, the 100th Battalion pushed into the hills. The terrain was a nightmare. There was no cover, only bare rock. To dig a foxhole was impossible. The men had to stack stones to build shallow sangars for protection, which shattered into deadly splinters under artillery fire. Supplies had to be hauled up by mules or on the backs of men, and the wounded had to be carried down steep, icy trails under constant observation. The fighting was close quarters and brutal. The Germans held the high ground at every turn, raining grenades and mortar fire down on the advancing Nisei. In the battle for the heights, the battalion suffered horrific losses. They had arrived in Italy with a strength of 1,300 men. By the time the Cassino campaign ground to a halt, only 521 combat-capable soldiers remained. They earned the nickname the Purple Heart Battalion, a title bought with blood on the slopes of Point 593 and Snakehead Ridge. Despite their heroism and the dogged advance of the 34th Division to within mere hundreds of yards of the monastery walls, the American drive stalled. The men were exhausted, freezing, and running low on ammunition. On February 11, the U.S. Second Corps, battered and broken, was withdrawn. The First Battle of Monte Cassino had ended in failure. This stalemate set the stage for the tragedy of February 15. As fresh troops from the New Zealand Corps and the 4th Indian Division moved into the line to replace the Americans, the gaze of every soldier fixed upon the Abbey. It dominated the skyline, a constant, brooding presence. To the infantrymen shivering in a waterlogged slit trench, it felt as though the monastery itself was the enemy. They were convinced that German artillery observers were up there, peering through high-powered binoculars, directing the fire that killed their friends. This belief, fueled by the desperation of the stalemate, led to the controversial order to bomb the Abbey. As the dust settled from the massive air raid on February 15, the tactical reality on the ground shifted instantly and disastrously. The Allied commanders had hoped the destruction of the Abbey would demoralize the enemy and destroy their observation posts. They were wrong on both counts. General Fridolin von Senger und Ederlin, the German corps commander and a lay Benedictine himself, had strictly forbidden his troops from entering the monastery to preserve its sanctity. The Germans were not inside the Abbey when the bombs fell, but once the Allies reduced the sacred site to a pile of rubble, the prohibition was lifted. The ruins of Monte Cassino were no longer a cultural treasure, they were a perfect defensive position. The thick stone walls, now collapsed, formed jagged ramparts that were impervious to artillery. The cellars remained intact, providing bomb-proof shelters. Into this fortress moved the men of the German 1st Parachute Division. These were the Green Devils, General Richard Heydrich's elite paratroopers. Tough, professional, and highly motivated, they turned the ruined monastery into an impregnable citadel. The bombing, intended to pave the way for an Allied breakthrough, had instead created the most formidable strongpoint in Italy. The Second Battle of Monte Cassino commenced immediately following the bombing, but it was doomed from the start. The Royal Sussex Regiment and the Rajputana Rifles launched attacks against the heights, but the German paratroopers, now entrenched in the rubble, cut them down with withering machine gun fire. The attacks failed to gain the summit. By March, the winter rains had turned the battlefield into a quagmire of mud and misery. The Allies decided to try again, this time shifting the focus from the mountains to the town of Cassino itself. The third battle, launched on March 15, began with another display of overwhelming firepower. This time, the target was the town at the foot of the mountain. Allied bombers dropped 1,000 tons of explosives on the small stone buildings, obliterating the streets and turning the town into a chaotic heap of masonry. Following the bombardment, New Zealand infantry and tanks, supported by Gurkhas from the 4th Indian Division, advanced into the ruins. They expected to find the defenders dead or stunned. Instead, they found the German paratroopers waiting. The rubble of the town, much like the Abbey above, provided excellent cover for snipers and anti-tank teams. The battle devolved into a savage house-to-house brawl. It was a sniper's war, fought at close range in the cellars and sewers of the destroyed town. For 8 days, the fighting raged. The Gurkhas managed to capture a feature known as Hangman's Hill, clinging to the rocky face just below the monastery, but they were cut off and unable to advance. In the town, New Zealand tanks were blocked by craters so deep they could not be crossed. The German defense was fanatical. Every pile of bricks held a machine gun. Every cellar entrance was booby-trapped. On March 23, with casualties mounting and no breakthrough in sight, the Allied commanders called a halt. The third battle had ended in another stalemate. April brought a lull to the front, but it was the quiet of preparation, not peace. The spring thaw began to dry the ground, and the Allied High Command drew up plans for one final, decisive blow. Operation Diadem. This was not merely another localized jab at the German chin. It was a haymaker aimed at the entire jaw of the occupation. General Alexander, commanding the Allied armies in Italy, had secretly shifted the bulk of the 8th Army from the Adriatic coast across the spine of the Apennines to the Cassino front. The plan relied on brute force and deception. While the Germans believed the Allies were resting, a massive concentration of men and materiel was assembling in the blind spots of the valleys. The scope of the offensive was staggering. 20 miles of front were activated, stretching from the sea to the mountain peaks. But the linchpin remained the same: the monastery. The task of cracking this nut, which had already broken the Americans, the New Zealanders, and the Indians, was handed to a force that fought with the desperation of men who had lost everything but their honor, the Polish Second Corps. Led by Lieutenant General W. Ladislaw Anders, these troops were unique in the Allied order of battle. They were not draftees from the American Midwest or regulars from the British Isles. They were exiles. Many had been prisoners in the Soviet gulags of Siberia just 2 years prior, released only after Hitler turned on Stalin. They had walked out of Russia, through the Middle East, and into Italy, carrying with them a burning hatred for totalitarianism in all its forms. When General Clark offered the assignment to Anders, the Polish commander accepted without consulting his subordinates. He knew the cost would be terrible, but he also knew that raising the Polish flag over the most impregnable fortress in Europe would be a political statement the world could not ignore. On the night of May 11, 1944, the Liri Valley held its breath. The moon was obscured, the darkness absolute. At 2300 hours, the silence was shattered not by a single shot, but by the simultaneous roar of 1,667 artillery pieces. The sky turned a violent, strobing violet. The ground shook with a rhythmic, sickening thud that could be felt through the soles of boots miles away. For 40 minutes, the Allied guns hammered the German positions, a drumfire so intense it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air. Then the barrage lifted, creeping forward, and the infantry stepped off into the dark. For the Poles, the objective was the massive, the cluster of peaks surrounding the monastery, specifically Point 593 and the Phantom Ridge. To get there, they had to traverse a landscape that had been stripped of all vegetation by 4 months of shelling. It was a moonscape of gray limestone, razor-sharp shrapnel, and unburied dead from previous assaults. The Germans of the 1st Parachute Division were waiting. They had survived the barrage in their deep, rock-hewn bunkers, and as the shelling lifted, they raced to their firing steps. As the Polish infantry climbed the exposed slopes, Spandau machine guns opened up from the darkness, their tracers weaving tight, deadly patterns across the rocky inclines. The fighting that ensued was medieval in its savagery. The Poles could not dig in. The ground was solid rock. They piled stones for cover, but the German mortars turned those stones into secondary projectiles. Casualties were catastrophic. Companies that began the ascent with full rosters were reduced to handfuls of men within hours. In the confusion of the night, radio contact was lost. Platoons fought in isolation, guided only by the muzzle flashes of the enemy. On the slopes of Point 593, the distance between the combatants closed to zero. Men fought with grenades, bayonets, and entrenching tools. The Green Devils of the German paratroops, widely considered the best defensive infantry in the war, found their match in the desperate ferocity of the Poles. But courage alone could not overcome the geometry of the battlefield. The Germans held the high ground, and every movement by the attackers drew precise, withering fire. By dawn on May 12, the Polish attack had stalled. The slopes were carpeted with bodies. The surviving Poles, clinging to the rocky face under the scorching sun, were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. The thirst was maddening. The mules carrying water had been slaughtered by artillery on the supply trails below. For 3 days, the battle hung in a bloody balance. General Anders, watching his corps bleed to death on the heights, refused to withdraw completely, keeping the pressure on the German lines while the British and French forces in the valley below began to chew through the Gustav Line's lower defenses. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was a result of cumulative pressure. To the south, French mountain troops, the Gaumiers, had performed a miracle of their own, scaling impassable mountains to flank the German positions. The Gustav Line was unhinging. Realizing they were about to be encircled, Field Marshal Kesselring finally gave the order the Allies had been waiting 4 months to hear: withdraw. On the night of May 17, the German paratroopers began to slip away. They moved like ghosts, abandoning the bunkers they had held against the world's most powerful armies. They left behind booby traps, mines, and a few rearguard snipers to delay the inevitable, but the main force pulled back to the next defensive belt, the Senger Line. The silence that fell over Monte Cassino in the early hours of May 18 was unnerving. The constant crash of artillery, and the rattle of machine guns, which had been the soundtrack of the valley for 122 days, simply stopped. A patrol from the Polish 12th Podolian Uhlans Regiment was the first to realize the change. Moving cautiously through the mist, stepping over the debris of war, they approached the ruins of the Abbey. There was no gunfire, no shouted commands in German, just the wind whistling through the shattered masonry. At the head of the patrol, the soldiers picked their way through the rubble of what had once been the Great Gate. The devastation was absolute. The bombing and artillery had pulverized the structure so thoroughly that it was difficult to tell where the walls ended and the mountain began. The air was thick with the sickly sweet smell of death, emanating from the hundreds of unburied bodies trapped in the stones. Inside the ruins, the Poles found a handful of wounded German soldiers who had been left behind, along with the battalion medical staff who had stayed to care for them. The enemy was gone. At 9:50 hours on May 18, 1944, the patrol scrambled to the highest remaining point of the ruins. They did not have a proper flag. In the chaos of the assault, standard colors were often left behind or lost, but they improvised. A regimental pennant was produced. With trembling hands, the soldiers lashed it to a branch and hoisted it above the dust. Minutes later, a bugler played the Hejnal Mariaki, the Krakow anthem. The notes drifted down from the mountain, floating over the valley floor, where thousands of Allied soldiers looked up in disbelief. The red and white flag of Poland snapped in the breeze, a splash of color against the gray ruin. Later, a Union Jack would be raised alongside it, but in that moment, the victory belonged to the exiles. The cost of that flag raising was etched into the very limestone of the mountain. In the final assault alone, the Polish Second Corps had lost over 1,000 men, their bodies scattered across the poppy-strewn slopes of Point 593 and the Phantom Ridge. These soldiers, who had marched out of the Siberian gulags to die on an Italian hillside, had paid the ultimate price for a piece of ground that was now little more than a jagged heap of pulverized masonry. Inside the perimeter of the Abbey, the scene was one of apocalyptic destruction. The great walls, which had stood since the Middle Ages, were reduced to knee-high piles of dust and stone. The Polish patrol moved cautiously through the cellars, weapons raised, their boots crunching on the debris of centuries. But the resistance they expected never came. In the deep recesses of the crypts, they found only the severely wounded German paratroopers who could not be moved, left behind in the care of their medical orderlies. The main body of the 1st Parachute Division, General Heydrich's Green Devils, had vanished. They had not routed. They had executed a masterful, fighting withdrawal under the cover of darkness. Even as the Poles were bleeding for every yard of the summit, the German paratroopers were slipping away to the north, falling back to their next defensive belt, the Sengir Line. They took their weapons, their discipline, and their reputation with them, leaving the Allies in possession of a prize that had been rendered strategically worthless by its total destruction. With the monastery finally in Allied hands, the linchpin of the Gustav Line was removed. The deadlock that had paralyzed the Italian campaign for 4 months was broken. In the valley below, the British 8th Army and the U.S. 5th Army surged forward. The capture of the heights allowed the engineers to finally bridge the rivers and clear the mines that had choked the Liri Valley. The road to Rome, Highway 6, was open, but the victory was somber. The Battle of Monte Cassino was not a singular event, but a 4-act tragedy that had consumed the lives of men from half a dozen nations. From the freezing waters of the Rapido in January to the sun-baked ruins of May, the campaign had been a relentless meat grinder. The casualty figures were staggering. The Allies suffered approximately 55,000 killed, wounded, or missing. The Germans, fighting from prepared positions that multiplied the effectiveness of every rifle and machine gun, lost an estimated 20,000 men. The landscape itself bore the scars of the violence. The town of Cassino, once a bustling community, had been erased from the map. Where houses and shops had stood, there was now only a flat, gray expanse of rubble, churned into mud by tank tracks and artillery craters. The monastery, a beacon of Western civilization founded in 529 AD, was a hollow shell. It was a testament to the ferocity of modern warfare, where culture and history were secondary to the brutal geometry of lines of sight and fields of fire. Yet, the momentum of the war did not pause for mourning. With the Gustav Line shattered, the German 10th Army was in danger of being encircled. General Alexander's Operation Diadem had succeeded in unhinging the German defenses, forcing Field Marshal Kesselring to order a general retreat north of Rome. The Sengir Line, though formidable, could not hold back the flood of Allied armor and infantry now pouring through the breach. On May 25, 1944, the Sengir positions collapsed. The race for the Italian capital began. For General Mark Clark, the commander of the U.S. Fifth Army, this was the culmination of a personal obsession. He was determined that American troops would be the first to liberate the Eternal City. As the Germans fought delaying actions at Valmontone and the Alban Hills, the Allied columns pressed on, driven by the knowledge that they were making history. On June 4, 1944, just 2 days before the eyes of the world would turn to the beaches of Normandy, the first American jeeps entered the outskirts of Rome. The reception was rapturous. Crowds of Italians flooded the streets, throwing flowers and climbing onto the tanks of the liberators. The German rearguard had pulled out only hours before, declaring Rome an open city to spare it the destruction that had befallen Cassino. The capture of Rome was a significant psychological victory, the first Axis capital to fall. It signaled the beginning of the end for fascist Italy and a major blow to the Third Reich. However, the strategic triumph was incomplete. The German 10th Army, though battered, had not been destroyed. They had escaped the trap in the Liris Valley and would live to fight another day, retreating to the Gothic line in the northern Apennines, where the war in Italy would drag on for another bloody year. But for the veterans of Cassino, the Texans of the 36th, the Nisei of the 100th, the Gurkhas, the Kiwis, and the Poles, the war had already reached its zenith in the shadow of that ruined abbey. They had faced the strongest defensive position in Europe, and through sheer grit and appalling sacrifice had prevailed. The monastery would eventually be rebuilt, stone by stone, rising once again over the valley. But the men who fought there would carry the memory of the Green Devils, the screaming Nebelwerfers, and the cold, rocky slopes for the rest of their lives. As the headlines shifted to France and the cross-channel invasion, the Italian theater began to fade from the public consciousness. It became the forgotten front. But for those who survived the 4 battles for Monte Cassino, there was no forgetting. They had walked through the fire in a place where the mountains themselves seemed to want them dead, and they had broken the line. The breach of the Gustav Line was not merely a tactical success. It was the bursting of a dam. For months, the Allied armies had been contained within a claustrophobic, violent cage of mountains and mud, hammering against a steel door that refused to budge. Now, with the heights of Monte Cassino secured and the Polish flag snapping over the ruins, the door was off its hinges. The energy that had been compressed into the Liris Valley released in a torrent of steel and gasoline, surging northward along Highway 6. But the transition from static attrition to mobile warfare was chaotic. The roads, pulverized by 4 months of relentless bombardment, crumbled under the weight of the advancing columns, creating a dusty, congested nightmare that allowed the retreating Germans to slip the noose. Despite the logistical snarl, the path to the Eternal City was finally open. The Allies marched on toward Rome, leaving the ruins of the monastery behind as a silent monument to the carnage of the Liris Valley. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.